All right, let's dive into a question that has haunted web developers for, well, decades. Is CSS broken? Should we just get rid of it and start over with something new? Today we're going to explore the surprisingly deep and kinda tricky world of web layout, and we'll find out why a task that seems so simple is actually one of the hardest problems out there.
I mean, if you've ever tried to build a web page, you know this feeling, right? Centering a div. It sounds like the easiest thing in the world, but for years it's been this legendary meme, a frustrating rite of passage for every developer. So why? Why is something so basic so ridiculously hard? This one question, it turns out, is the perfect doorway into this whole debate.
And look, this is not some new complaint. People have been wrestling with CSS for a very long time, trying to make it do what they want. Back in the 2000s, just getting a simple 3-column layout to work was so tough that developers literally called it the Holy Grail layout. It's this long, shared history of frustration that has led so many people to say, come on, there has to be a better way.
And that leads us to a really tempting idea. What if we just threw CSS out? What if we replaced it with a totally different system, one based on a much more direct, more logical idea called constraints? On the surface, it sounds like a dream come true. So what is a constraint system, really? Well, instead of writing a bunch of rules about margins and padding and hoping for the best, you just state the facts. You define the direct relationships you want. For example, you could write one single line of code that says the center of this box must equal the center of its parent. And that's it. A powerful solver engine just does all the math and figures out the exact pixel position. It's a totally different, more direct way of thinking.
So let's put these two philosophies side by side. With CSS, which is rule-based, you write a set of rules, and the browser runs this big, complicated layout algorithm to figure out what the page should look like. With constraints, you write direct relationships, and the browser runs a constraint solver to find a solution that makes all of your statements true. Two very different ways to get to the same end goal.
And you can see why this is so appealing, right? You get direct, predictable control. That whole centering a div problem? Yeah, that's one line of code now. And this isn't some fantasy. Constraint-based systems are the real deal. They're used to build the user interfaces on every single iPhone. And they are incredibly fast, powered by solvers that can update layouts in a blink. It really does sound like the perfect replacement for CSS. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This is where our story takes a sharp turn. Because this seemingly perfect solution, it has this deep, ironic flaw hiding just under the surface. Yep, you heard that right. The great irony is that a system designed for absolute mathematical predictability can become wildly unpredictable. See, when you give a computer a set of purely logical rules, it can fail in some very specific and very, very frustrating ways. So, problem number one is what's called an underdetermined system. Imagine you tell the solver to center a box, but you forget to give it a size. Well, a 10-pixel box can be centered, a 100-pixel box can be centered, a 500-pixel box can be centered. There are infinite possible layouts that fit your rule. So which one does the computer choose? Who knows? The result can feel completely random. Then you have the opposite problem, which is honestly even worse, an overdetermined system. Let's say you tell a box it must be 200 pixels wide. Then you add another rule that says it must be 100 pixels from the left edge and 100 pixels from the right edge of a 500 pixel wide screen. We'll do the math. That's impossible. Your rules literally contradict each other. There is no solution, so the layout just breaks. So those are your two big failure states. When a system is underdetermined, your rules are too loose, and you get chaos. When it's overdetermined, your rules are too strict, and you get a total breakdown. Trying to figure out which one is happening can be an absolute nightmare. So how do you fix this? Well, you start adding more rules. You tell the system things like, if there are multiple solutions, always pick the smallest one. Or you assign weights to rules so the solver knows which one to ignore when there's a conflict. But wait a second. As you start adding all these fixes, you're not writing simple, direct constraints anymore. You're just building another complex system of rules, which is the exact problem you were trying to escape from with CSS in the first place. This whole journey leads us to a much deeper realization. Maybe the problem isn't CSS, and maybe it isn't constraints. Maybe the real problem is that web layout itself is just fundamentally, incredibly, mind-bogglingly hard. I mean, just stop for a second and think about everything a single web layout has to handle. It needs to work on a tiny phone and a giant 4K monitor. It has to gracefully adapt when a user zooms in, or when their operating system renders a font just a little bit differently.
It has to deal with new content being loaded in, work around a phone's camera notch, and even handle different languages, like a super long German word compared to a very short Chinese character. The number of variables is just staggering.
So with all that complexity in mind, let's go back to CSS. Let's look closer at a rule we all think we understand. Let's see what's really going on inside a simple rule like text-align center. There's some hidden wisdom in there.
Okay, here's the story. Your goal is simple. Center some text. But what happens if the box the text is in is too small? A purely logical system might just let the text overflow out of both sides equally. But that's not what CSS does. CSS does something much smarter. It automatically snaps the text back to be left aligned. Why would it do that? To make sure the beginning of the sentence is still visible on the screen, so you can actually read it.
And that right there, that's the whole point. What at first seems like a funky, weird quirk is actually a brilliant, user-focused design choice. It's hard-earned wisdom from decades of experience baked right into the system. CSS isn't just a set of dumb rules. It has opinions about what makes a good, readable layout. And you know what? Usually those opinions are pretty good.
So if starting from scratch is a trap, and the old system actually has some hidden genius in it, where does that leave us? Well, the path forward isn't revolution, it's evolution.
See, the real problem was never CSS as a whole. The problem was that for years, we were using parts of CSS that were designed for laying out text documents, like a blog post or an article, and we were trying to use those same tools to build complex, modern web applications. We were using a hammer to drive in a screw. Sure, you could make it work, but it was always going to be awkward and frustrating.
You know, there's a great analogy for this. Think about JavaScript. It has all sorts of weird, quirky parts. But did we throw it out? No. The community built better tools, like TypeScript, on top of it to help us avoid the messy parts. The exact same thing happened with CSS. We don't have to use those old, clunky layout methods anymore, because now we have modern tools built for the modern web.
And those modern tools are, of course, Flexbox and Grid. They were designed from the ground up to build complex user interfaces. They're way more intuitive, they have far fewer of those frustrating sharp edges, and most importantly, they carry forward all of that hidden, hard-earned wisdom about how layouts should actually behave in the real messy world.
So in the end, the solution wasn't some radical burn-it-all-down replacement. It was the slow, steady, and thoughtful work that the CSS Standards Committee has been doing all along, actually listening to developers, identifying the real pain points, and building powerful, intuitive, new layout modes to solve them.
And that leaves us with the final thought that goes way beyond just websites. When we're faced with a big, complicated, frustrating system, is the answer always to tear it down and start over? Or is there a deeper wisdom in a more thoughtful evolution, in taking the time to understand a system's flaws, respect its hidden strengths, and build better tools upon its time-tested foundation? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.